In this video, I'm going to tell you why it took me 40 years before I played my first true cyberpunk wargame. I've played across historical battlefields, deep space conflicts, fantasy realms, and pulp adventures. But one genre has always been missing: cyberpunk. It's only now, after all this time, that I've finally taken the plunge. And that might seem strange, because cyberpunk as a genre has been around for most of my gaming life. I was aware of it, I liked the aesthetic, but somehow I never actually played it as a wargame. So today, I want to talk to you why, after all these years, I'm only just properly getting into cyberpunk wargaming. Let's go back to the beginning. The first wargames I ever played were back in the 1970s, using Airfix HO00 World War II miniatures. No fancy rule sets, no carefully balanced armies, just whatever figures we had thrown together into battles on the living room floor. We built terrain from household junk, a habit that stuck with me to this day. Then, in the 1980s, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and that got me into Warhammer Fantasy Battle. This was the first time I'd really built proper armies, painting them up and playing in full campaigns. Around the same time, I discovered the Traveller Sci-Fi RPG, and that led to LaserBurn, and later Imperial Commander, which were my first sci-fi experiences wargaming. That naturally led to Warhammer 40K Rogue Trader when it was released, and like a lot of people, I got swept up in that. But even as 40K grew into a massive franchise, Cyberpunk Wargaming just wasn't on my radar. And that's strange, because I was absolutely influenced by Cyberpunk, just not in a way that immediately translated to the Wargames tabletop. One of my earliest big influences was 2000 AD. Judge Dredd was massive for me, with its grimy megacity one, corporate greed, and brutal street warfare. Then there was Strontium Dog, with Johnny Alpha, and that mix of bounty hunters, mutants, intergalactic lawlessness. That dystopian, neon-drenched world was exactly what cyberpunk is about. Then came the films. THX 1138 was one of the first sci-fi films I ever saw that wasn't about spaceships and laser battles. It was about surveillance, corporate control, and dehumanization. And then, of course, Blade Runner came along, rewired my brain. That film redefined cyberpunk for me. The aesthetic, the mood, the sense of a world falling apart under the weight of its own technology. I was obsessed, but struggled to translate it into a gaming experience. I had the original Cyberpunk 2013 RPG rulebook when it came out, but we couldn't recreate our enjoyment of the film while playing the game like we could with D&D or Traveller. But Cyberpunk wasn't just a Western thing. The Japanese side of Cyberpunk hit me just as hard. In the early 90s, when anime started to properly filter into the UK, I'd already watched Akira and started reading Hobby Japan and New Type magazines. Akira is just as much cyberpunk as Blade Runner. I'm not sure everyone puts it in the same bracket, but look at it. The dystopian setting, the corrupt government, the rise of street-level power through technology. That's cyberpunk. Then you had Robotech and Gundam, which were also massive influences for me. I started collecting Robotech kits before I even found Gundam, and I managed to get some really rare original Robotech kits second-hand and restore them. We even tried the Robotech RPG. Now, at the time it felt cyberpunk, even though in hindsight it was probably more sci-fi. But think about it, the heroes of the Robotech Macross saga weren't elite soldiers. They were a pop star and her boyfriend. They were ordinary people thrown into a high-tech war. And that, for me, really captured the cyberpunk versus the system feeling. And then, of course, there's Robocop, the ultimate cyberpunk film of the late 80s. It wasn't just about cool armour and shootouts, it was about corporate greed and one individual trying to fight back. It was the cyberpunk story of right versus wrong, man becoming a cybernetic machine, and what happens when corporations own everything, including law enforcement. And I've got this, my 1/6 scale Robocop model by Horizon from about 1989, which I lovingly painted and was on display for years because that film left such a lasting impression on me. In the meantime, my gaming focus shifted. Warhammer Fantasy Battle became my main game again for a while, but after years of painting regiments, I found myself drawn to something different. Pulp adventure gaming. Pulp was great because it needed fewer figures, but much more complex terrain. I was getting older. My eyesight wasn't as sharp as it used to be. I could still paint miniatures, but I wasn't enjoying it as much. What I did enjoy was building terrain, creating full immersive settings to tell stories in. And that shift naturally led to superhero skirmish games, which used a lot of the same terrain principles, and that unknowingly set the stage for cyberpunk. Because if you think about it, cyberpunk terrain isn't too different from what I was already making for Pulp and superhero games. Dense cityscapes, rooftops, industrial areas, street-level combat zones. It was all already there. The only thing missing was the neon. So what changed? Why now? The short answer is the tools finally caught up. For years, cyberpunk was intimidating to build as a tabletop setting. Most wargames are set in open battlefields, deserts, forests, medieval ruins. But cyberpunk? That's all urban density, and terrain was the biggest barrier. But now, with 3D printing, MDF terrain kits, and affordable LED lighting, I could finally build the city I wanted. Once I realised that, everything else started to click into place. Miniatures became easier to source. There are fantastic Cyberpunk STL files available now, and companies like Heroes Infinite, Corvus Games Terrain, and Anvil Industries are making incredible kits. Another massive barrier was the narrative problem. Most cyberpunk stories aren't about armies and mass combat. They're about individual characters. A single hacker, a street samurai, a getaway driver. It's hard to wargame that without just turning it into another RPG. But then the Matrix came along and it changed my perspective again. It showed how cyberpunk could scale into wargaming. The way the program sent out endless copies of Agent Smith into the virtual world, and how the Sentinels swarmed in the real world, and that was something you could wargame. It took cyberpunk, which had always felt small and personal, and gave it scale. And that's what got me hooked. It's not just about playing a game for me, it's about telling stories in this cyberpunk world through wargames. This isn't line up your troops and fight. It's about corporate enforcers raiding a gang hideout. It's about data heists gone wrong. It's about a city that feels alive with glowing billboards, flickering streetlights, and Johnny cabs waiting to be hijacked. We're not just playing cyberpunk wargames now. I'm building a world. We just needed a set of rules. There just wasn't a go-to cyberpunk miniatures game. Shadowrun was doing great in RPGs, but it wasn't a tabletop battle system. Necromunda had some cyberpunk elements, but it was still very much 40k. It wasn't until much later that games like Infinity appeared, and even then, it was more sleek sci-fi than true cyberpunk. Most wargame systems don't actually feature technology as a gameplay mechanic. They focus on tactical factors, cover, movement, attack rolls, but cyberpunk is about much more than that. It's about hacking into a power station to overload it, commandeering a vehicle remotely, or even swaying a mob to be on your side with a song or a revolutionary message. And that's what Cyberpunk should be. But we haven't found a rule set that does it, apart from maybe Reality's Edge. And that looks like it's going to be a complex rule set to learn and play. That's why we're using these old Imperial Commander rules. They seem somewhat Spartan and naive compared to these modern glossy rule sets. But they give us a solid tactical framework while allowing us to add in the technical and charisma-based elements that affect the outcomes of a game. Like using battle magic in a fantasy wargame without bending the rules too much. Most importantly for us, it's the simplicity factor. Most of the systems that try to do everything, hacking, vehicles, social influence, become too complex. We don't have all day to play a single game. We need a resolution in a couple of hours, an afternoon at most, because we now have busy family lives to lead. The game needs to be exciting, fast-paced, action-packed, and whether you win or lose, it has to be fun to play. So here we are, after 40 years, finally diving into Cyberpunk Wargaming properly. And honestly, it feels like the right time. The terrain is better, the miniatures are better, and the storytelling possibilities are endless. If you've ever thought about getting into Cyberpunk Wargaming but felt like it was too much effort, trust me, I was right there with you. But it's finally possible to do it without breaking the bank or losing your sanity. What got you into Cyberpunk? Or like me, has it always been a genre you always loved but never actually played? Can you suggest a fast-paced rule set which combines combat and cyber hacking that I haven't mentioned? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to see some more Cyberpunk Wargaming content, stick around, because this is just the beginning. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the neon-lit streets of Aurora Junction.